The morning mist clung low over the fields of Lower Saxony, a pale ghost that refused to lift even as the British convoy rolled in. It was May of 1945, and the war, though officially ended, had left behind a world still gasping in disbelief. The British soldiers, many barely out of their youth, carried expressions hardened by 6 years of endless war. They had seen the camps, the mass graves, the ruins of cities that once stood proud. Yet what waited for them in this small German village was something quieter, something that whispered rather than screamed. The aftermath of defeat. Private Thomas Hargreaves, a 22-year-old from Yorkshire, climbed down from his truck. He adjusted his webbing and looked around at the dilapidated barn that had been repurposed as a temporary holding site for German prisoners of war. But these were not men. These were women, former auxiliaries of the Wehrmacht, nurses, clerks, and, according to the intelligence reports, possibly members of the infamous female units who had served near concentration camps. When Thomas stepped through the broken doorway, the stench hit him first, a blend of decay, human desperation, and the faint odor of rotting straw. Inside, a group of women huddled together beneath torn blankets. Their faces were ghostly pale, their cheeks hollow. Eyes that once held pride or ideology now seemed lost, detached from the present moment. He watched one of them, blonde, her hair matted and thin, attempt to stand. She wavered, then collapsed again, her body too weak to support itself. Without thinking, Thomas dropped to his knees beside her. He offered his water flask. She tried to push it away, mumbling something in broken English, but he pressed it into her hand. Her eyes flicked upward and met his. There was no recognition of sides, no mention of victory or surrender. Only the faint reflection of shared humanity. The sergeant behind him barked an order to move on, to document the prisoners and proceed with ration distribution. But Thomas lingered for a moment longer, watching as the woman clutched the flask like a sacred relic. Her lips trembled as she drank, and in that fragile act, something within him began to shift. The war had told him that mercy was a weakness. Yet now, standing amid the defeated, he felt the terrible weight of what victory truly meant. These were not soldiers anymore. They were remnants, starved, broken, forgotten. And when she looked at him again, whispering something too faint to hear, he uttered the words almost unconsciously. "You are mine now, not as a possession, not as a threat, but as a vow, an unspoken promise to protect what little humanity the war had left unburned." Thomas had expected hatred. He had imagined that seeing the enemy, especially German women, would stir the bitterness that had fueled him through the long years of blood and mud. But as days passed, that hatred dissolved like snow under spring sun. He watched them eat, slowly, carefully, as the British rations were distributed. They devoured the thin soup as though it were gold. He saw how they fought against their own pride, avoiding the soldiers' gazes as if ashamed of their weakness. The woman he had helped, whose name he later learned was Anna Weber, barely spoke. She was 25, once a clerk in a Luftwaffe logistics unit stationed near Hamburg. She had lost her brother in Stalingrad, her father in an Allied bombing raid, and her mother to starvation during the final winter of the war. Her loyalty had long been replaced by silence. Thomas was supposed to maintain distance. They were the enemy, and the regulations forbade any personal involvement. Yet he found himself returning to the barn every evening, bringing bread, sometimes chocolate, or a blanket when the nights grew cold. Anna began to speak, her English halting but clear enough. She told him how her unit had fled before the British advance, how they had hidden in the woods, how hunger had stripped them of everything, including their humanity. One evening, as rain fell softly on the roof, Thomas asked her a question he did not plan to ask. "Why did you stay? Why not escape?" She looked at him, eyes reflecting the dim light of a lantern. There was nowhere to go. The war took everything, even the reason to run. He had no answer. The silence that followed was not awkward, but heavy with the kind of understanding that words could not shape. In those quiet moments, Thomas began to see not an enemy but a mirror, a reflection of his own exhaustion, his own brokenness. For all the flags and borders, they were the same. Young souls consumed by an old man's war. When the orders came to transfer the prisoners to a formal internment camp, Thomas felt something inside him twist. The thought of Anna being marched away into another cage, another nameless bureaucracy, filled him with dread. He had spent years fighting for his country, but now, for the first time, he felt compelled to fight for a single person. By the spring of 1945, the British Army occupied large parts of northern Germany. The Third Reich had fallen, yet the human wreckage it left behind extended far beyond the battlefields. Millions of displaced persons, prisoners, and refugees crowded roads and camps, searching for food, shelter, or a fragment of home. The treatment of German prisoners of war varied drastically depending on time and circumstance. Male prisoners, particularly those from the Waffen-SS, often endured harsh internment conditions, driven by both necessity and vengeance. But the women, especially those who had served in auxiliary roles, fell into an ambiguous space between guilt and victimhood. For the British, the challenge was moral as much as logistical. The Geneva Convention dictated humane treatment of prisoners, yet resources were stretched thin. Civilians in England were still under rationing. Soldiers themselves went hungry. Compassion, while noble, was often a luxury. Among the occupying troops were young men like Thomas Hargreaves, ordinary soldiers who had entered the war as boys and emerged carrying memories too heavy for peace. They had fought across France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, watching comrades fall under artillery fire, seeing civilians displaced and starving. Victory had been proclaimed, but the emotional debris of 6 years of total war did not vanish overnight. In Germany, surrender did not mean safety. The Allied forces, in their attempt to stabilize the region, created temporary holding facilities. Many of these makeshift camps were hastily converted barns, schools, or open fields. Conditions were dire. Inadequate food, sanitation, and medical care were common. Female prisoners, particularly those associated with the military, were often mistrusted. Some Allied soldiers saw them as complicit, believing they had supported the Nazi regime. Others viewed them as victims, drawn into a system that had consumed everyone in its path. For women like Anna Weber, captivity came after years of deprivation. By the war's end, many German civilians were already on the brink of starvation. Bombings had destroyed supply chains, rail lines, and harvests. Entire regions lived on thin soups made from weeds and stale bread. When the British forces arrived, they found a nation on its knees. But amid the ruins, moral questions lingered. How should the victors treat the defeated? What separated justice from vengeance, compassion from betrayal? Thomas's story unfolded within that uncertain moral landscape. His act of kindness, one soldier helping one starving woman, was insignificant in the vast machinery of occupation. Yet it symbolized something quietly profound: the rediscovery of humanity at the edge of annihilation. History remembers battles and treaties, but not the fleeting moments in barns when enemies shared bread and silence. Yet those were the moments that rebuilt the moral spine of post-war Europe. Life in the camp settled into rhythm. Each morning, the British guards distributed rations, thin soup, black bread, occasionally canned meat. The women lined up in silence, their uniforms replaced with ragged civilian clothes scavenged from nearby ruins. They moved slowly, conserving strength. Thomas was assigned to the supply depot, but found reasons to visit the barn daily. His sergeant noticed but said nothing. Everyone was exhausted. The strictness of military protocol had begun to erode under the sheer weight of human suffering. He began learning German phrases. Guten Morgen. Wie geht es Ihnen? Simple words that made Anna smile faintly. She would correct his pronunciation with quiet amusement. For the first time since the war began, laughter, small, hesitant, found its way between them. The women, too, began to change. With food and rest, their faces regained some color. They mended clothing, scrubbed the floors, tended a small vegetable patch near the fence. Though still prisoners, they reclaimed fragments of normal life. Thomas sometimes read aloud from a pocket Bible his mother had given him before he left for France. He had not opened it in years, but when Anna asked him to read, he found comfort in the old, familiar verses. She listened with eyes closed, as if the words carried warmth no fire could provide. In those quiet evenings, surrounded by the muted sounds of the countryside, it felt as though the world outside no longer existed. The war, with its endless noise and grief, had receded into memory. Yet the past was never far. One afternoon, a convoy brought in a new group of prisoners, women from a camp near Bergen-Belsen. Their hollow faces and trembling hands reminded Thomas of the photographs he had seen of the dead. Anna avoided looking at them. When he asked why, she whispered, "We all knew, but we did not want to know. That is our sin." The weight of that confession stayed with him. It shattered the fragile peace he had built around his feelings. Later, when rain began to fall, he stood outside the barn, staring at the horizon. The fields stretched endlessly, scarred by bomb craters, scattered with the remains of war. Somewhere beyond lay England, his home, but it felt impossibly far away. He had gone to war to defend his country, to destroy evil. Now he wondered what victory meant when even the innocent carried guilt. Anna often spoke of her mother's garden, how she would grow tulips and lavender every spring. She used to say flowers do not care who plants them, Anna told him one evening. They bloom even in the enemy's soil. It was then that Thomas realized what the war had stolen most completely, the belief that goodness could still exist. And yet, sitting beside her, hearing her fragile voice speak of flowers, he felt something like hope stir within him again. Days passed. Rumors spread that many of the women would be released soon. Others would be transferred for questioning. The uncertainty hung heavy over everyone. When Thomas was ordered to prepare for reassignment to another sector, he knew their time was ending. That night, as the lantern burned low, he reached for her hand. She did not pull away. "Promise me," she said softly, "that you will remember we were not all the same." "I will," he replied, and for once he believed it. The next morning, Thomas woke before dawn. The air was thick with mist again, just as it had been the day he arrived. He walked toward the barn quietly, careful not to wake the others. Inside, Anna was already awake, sitting by the small window, watching the pale light break across the fields. He told her he was leaving. She nodded slowly, eyes fixed on the horizon. "I knew," she said. "You have that look of someone who does not belong in places like this." Thomas tried to smile, but the words caught in his throat. "I wish I could take you with me." She turned to him, her expression unreadable. "No, you must go home. You must live for those who cannot." He wanted to tell her that he was not sure what home meant anymore, that he had changed too much to fit back into the quiet lanes of Yorkshire, but he said nothing. Instead, he reached into his pocket and handed her a small silver pendant, his mother's cross. "It kept me alive," he said. "Now it is yours." She hesitated, then took it, pressing it to her chest. "Then I will live for both of us." It was the first and last time they embraced. There was no passion in it, no desperate clinging, only a deep, wordless understanding that they had both survived something that would haunt them forever. As he walked away, the barn fading behind him, Thomas felt both lighter and more burdened than ever. He had entered this place as a soldier and was leaving as something else. Something unsure, raw, painfully human. In the days that followed, the British Army withdrew from smaller camps, consolidating operations as Germany transitioned into occupation zones. Thomas was reassigned to Hamburg, where the devastation was almost beyond imagination. Entire neighborhoods lay in ruins. Children scavenged among the rubble. The air still carried the faint odor of smoke. He performed his duties mechanically. Guard rotations, supply logs, endless paperwork. But his thoughts always returned to that barn, to Anna's face in the half-light. He wondered if she had been released, if she had found food, if she had survived at all. When the official declaration came that all hostilities had ceased, the streets erupted with muted relief. But there was no celebration in Thomas's heart. He stood on a bridge overlooking the Elbe River and realized that the war had ended only on paper. Inside, it would continue for the rest of his life. Thomas returned to England in early 1946. The train carried him through landscapes that seemed untouched by war. Green fields, quiet towns, the distant smoke of factory chimneys. Yet to him, everything felt different. His mother greeted him with tears and open arms. His father, a miner, said little but nodded with quiet pride. They tried to fill the silence with stories, with meals, with laughter. But Thomas remained distant, haunted by faces that England could not see. He took work as a postal clerk, sorting letters by day and walking empty streets by night. Every time he saw a woman with fair hair, he thought of Anna. Sometimes he dreamed of her standing in the mist, holding the silver cross. Years passed. The world moved on. Germany rebuilt. The Allies became allies once more. But for Thomas, the memory of that barn remained a scar that time could not fade. In 1953, he returned to Europe for the first time since the war, as part of a veteran's visit to the battlefields. When the tour reached northern Germany, he asked quietly to be left behind for a day. He took a train to Lower Saxony and walked for hours along country roads until he found the place. The barn was gone, collapsed, overgrown with grass and wildflowers. Only a few stones marked where it had stood. Thomas stood there for a long time, listening to the wind. He reached into his coat pocket and took out a small photograph of his regiment. On the back, in faded ink, he had written her name. He placed it among the stones and whispered, "You are free now." Then he turned and walked away, the sun breaking through the clouds above him. History often speaks of victory and defeat, of heroes and villains, of nations rising and falling. Yet beneath those grand narratives lie smaller truths, quiet, fragile, human truths. Thomas Hargreaves did not win the war. He survived it. And in that survival, he discovered something far greater than triumph: the ability to see an enemy as a person. For Anna Weber, and for countless others like her, the end of war did not bring peace. It brought hunger, guilt, and the long shadow of memory. But in one act of mercy, in a soldier's decision to share water instead of hate, something enduring was born. Years later, when Thomas's grandchildren would ask him about the war, he would tell them not of battles or medals, but of a barn in Germany, and a woman who taught him what it meant to be human again. The war had divided the world, but compassion, quiet, stubborn compassion, had the power to mend it, one heart at a time. And perhaps that is the true legacy of victory. Not the conquest of nations, but the rediscovery of the human soul.